Welcome everyone to meet the Grantmakers online. We're so excited to have you join us for this lively discussion with leaders from all across the country in philanthropy. My name is Angela Richardson. I'll be your host for the afternoon. I'm a senior trainer at the Grantsmanship Center, and it's my delight and my pleasure to welcome you and our guests. Before we get started and before I introduce our hosts, I just want to thank those other the organizations that are sponsoring today's event. They include Grant Station, of course, the Grantsmanship Center, and Foundant as well. So thank you to all of them for making this possible. There's about 500 of you on the line already, and that's so exciting. So I want to just start by saying how inspiring it is to have this many people on the line that are interested in what's going on in philanthropy and interested in learning about what's new in our sector. And also thank you for so many of the questions. There are over 100 questions that came in when we sent out the call. So we'll get to as many as we can today with our esteemed group of panelists, which it's my pleasure to introduce quickly. So they will each tell you a little bit more about themselves as they have time to introduce their organizations. But I'll just quickly tell you who they are, and maybe if they'll just raise their hand quickly, then you'll know who they are. So we'll start with Darren Goff Sr. He's the president and CEO of the Coastal Community Foundation of South Carolina. Darrin is a leader across sectors, including government, nonprofits, higher education, and the private industry. In addition to his position currently, Darrin also was president and CEO of the Capital Area United Way in Baton Rouge. So welcome, Darrin, and thank you for being with us. Yeah. Next up, we have Julie Voyles. She's the Senior Program Officer at the Denver Foundation. Julie brings 29 years of experience in philanthropy and nonprofits, including social work and advocacy. Julie's focuses on strategically tackling broad societal issues for cultural, systemic, and policy change. And I just learned she also does some woodworking. So welcome, Julie, and thank you for being here. And next and finally is Dallas Dishman of David Geffen Foundation. And David's the executive director at the foundation. He's served as executive director since 2002 and currently oversees more than $30 million in annual domestic grants. Dallas also serves as the Arts and Cultural Commission for the city of West Hollywood here in the Los Angeles area. Dallas and I are in the same location. So welcome, Dallas. Thank you for being here as well. So just really quickly for all of you out there, our format for today is I've pulled together several of the questions that many of you sent in. The panelists will each have an opportunity to answer the questions that you guys sent in. They'll first start by introducing themselves a little bit. I want to let you know that those of you that are out there that you will have received the profiles from their foundations. So they won't repeat that information, but they will give you some additional information in addition to what they'll answer in our question and answer period. So let's just jump right in, and I'm gonna have you all introduce yourselves and your foundations, sort of starting with the order that I introduced you. So Darrin, that means let's start with you.
Yeah, Angela, thank you. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon in South Carolina. And I know it's still morning out on the West Coast. So thank you all for joining us from wherever you are in the country. The Coastal Community Foundation, if you read the profile, we serve the 9 counties of coastal South Carolina, from essentially North Carolina down to Georgia. We're approximately $300 million in assets and run multiple programs, grant-making programs in our 9-county region. The region is both rural and urban, small and large, and like most places in the country, it is being fully affected by COVID-19, the pandemic, and then much of the social, racial movement that's going on throughout our communities. And I'm happy to share more about our grant making and community leadership as it relates to those items. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Julie?
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Again, also, I really appreciate your interest in hearing from us and learning from us. And I also appreciate all the work that all of you do. I am a senior program officer at the Denver Foundation. We were founded in 1925, and we serve the 7-county Denver metro area. You have read our description. I think the one thing I wanted to highlight really is about our commitment to an investment in racial equity and community engagement. This is really a significant part of our work, and it's both in our internal practices, our internal culture, our own staff learning, as well as in what we do in our grant making. And I just, also want to say that some examples of that include, we just launched the Black Resilience in Colorado Fund, and it was established to direct resources to address systemic racism and its impact on Black communities. And the goal is within the first year is to distribute $1 million, and it really is to help build the capacity and the sustainability of Black-led organizations. We also do something called the Executive Director Leaders of Color Institute, which helps develop leaders of color and develop their capacity as leaders. And I think the only other thing I wanted to highlight is another area that we call the SHIFT organizations, which is a capacity building program to help nonprofits shift from treating constituents as participants and treating them as contributors and potentiators. So those are some really good examples of this commitment to diversity and equity. And I know that it is also a question that has come from you all. So just wanted to highlight those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Dallas.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with everyone this morning and this afternoon, wherever you happen to be. I understand that we even have a few folks outside of the US who were registered to join us. So I guess it could be evening as well. So as Angela mentioned, I am the Executive Director of the David Geffen Foundation. And the foundation was created in 1986 by David Geffen, and we operate as ostensibly like a family foundation, in the sense that Mr. Geffen is the principal and is involved in every grant making decision. He doesn't have a family per se, in the sense that he doesn't have a spouse or children or any immediate family. So it largely is his foundation, and the giving is directed toward areas and issues that are of importance to him. We are a non-operating foundation in the sense that we don't run any programs specifically. We fund 501c3 public charities, principally in Los Angeles and New York City. And again, this goes back to being a sort of a family foundation. Mr. Geffen was born in Brooklyn and spent the first part of his life in New York, and has since lived in Los Angeles. So we very much operate in the kind of community partner, give where you live mode of grant making. Last year, we paid out about 41 million in grants, and that sort of skews things a bit and probably makes it sound like we're a very large organization, but actually we are an extremely small organization. So I think as we delve into the questions, you'll learn more interesting things about us. So with that, I'll give it back to you, Angela.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to hearing all the different perspectives. We have West Coast, we have the South, we have the mountain area. So it should give everybody a really wide breadth of what's going on in our country. When I do trainings, I often tell participants, when you know one foundation, you know exactly one foundation, because all of you are so different. And so I'm always really excited to host panels like this. So the first question we'll start with is really about, there were a number of questions about COVID-19 and the environment right now, and what the impact of COVID-19 is having on your foundation, its priorities, and its expectations for grantees, as well as future giving. That can include things like what you're forecasting for the year coming up, and anything that you would like to add about how the current environment is really impacting and directing your grant making and how you work with grantees. So the way we'll do it is, if anyone feels called first, you can just, jump in and we'll go that way. Raise your hand or whatever.
All right, since I'm not on mute, I'll jump in first.
Thank you.
So here at the Geffen Foundation, unlike many of our colleagues across the country, we haven't established a specific COVID-19 fund. However, we've already made grants in excess of $1 million toward various COVID-19 projects, specifically around hunger relief and direct care, principally to community-based clinics. One of our major funding areas is health and healthcare. And so that's where the majority of our COVID funding has gone, is to those community-based clinics in an effort to defray the strain on emergency rooms and to continue to provide other forms of non-COVID care to the community, largely in underserved communities around LA and New York City. In general, our plan is to continue with our historic funding patterns. That is, we're not shifting away from our other areas, which are HIV and AIDS, civil liberties. Obviously, we're looking at ramping up in civil liberties as the socio-political climate is shifting and the need is dramatically increasing. In the arts, we'll continue to fund in the arts. And we fund in the Jewish community as well, sort of a broad catchment of issues in the Jewish community. So we'll continue to fund in all of those areas, including general health care. So for us, it's been an increase in funding specific for COVID, but our overall mode of operation will, at this point, will continue to be the same, and we'll continue to fund those organizations that are not COVID specific.
That's great. A number of questions came in just wondering, will it mean that everyone will shift to just funding things? So it's great to hear that the Geffen Foundation is kind of continuing as you've done. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Who else would like to jump in on that?
Go ahead and speak up. So we had a real immediate response to COVID in that we partnered with the city, partnered with the state, and created a lot of collaborative funding pools with other foundations. And initially really was this immediate response to health needs and housing and food, and that those needs also have continued, so that's not going anywhere. We also pushed out a lot of money really quickly. So for example, I'm responsible for the education portfolio, and we almost spent our entire grant budget by May 1, with a real understanding that nonprofits needed money and they needed it fast. And we did a lot of expedited grants, no site visits, just get the money out the door. We shifted everything to general operating. And then there's some specific funding pools where we created a funding pool in partnership with other foundations around arts and culture organizations. The Black Resilience of Colorado Fund was started out of COVID. So there's been sort of, looking at the landscape and trying to understand where are the greatest needs and where can we fit into that. So in terms of next year, that's an interesting question because we are in the middle, we had already started and are continuing to be in the middle of a strategic planning process. So I have no idea what we're going to be doing next year and how much of it is going to be COVID related. I certainly know that it's going to impact how we do work and what we're going to do, but I think we're also continuing to look at the long-term picture about what the community needs and not going to sort of ignore issues, for example, around education or basic human needs. So, but I do think there's going to be an overlay around COVID.
Thank you. I love when you said, we have no idea. I think so many of us are really in that we have no idea and here's what we're thinking. So I really appreciate that you shared that as well. I know a lot of people out there are feeling that too. All right, Darren.
Yeah, the only thing I will really add to what Julie and Dallas has already mentioned specific to the foundation, because we're doing a lot of the same kind of work in terms of being responsive to the needs of the local community, using, frankly, local data to determine and focus where our grant making is in respect to the COVID-19 pandemic and the surges in terms of essential services, basic needs, food and housing. Is that we are sort of, if I sort of move forward, look forward, we started thinking about what reopening would look like several months ago, and work with our board to identify a few priorities. Julie, you mentioned schools and what schools might need to do in terms of reopening, and how for us as a foundation, we support that as an intentional part of the process we're thinking about, both with our COVID-19 Relief and Recovery Fund, which we raised a couple $1 million for that, deployed about half of it now, and are working to deploy the other half, but also with donors through our DAF program, Donor Advised Fund programs, and helping them to think maybe more strategically about what might be coming the fall when schools reopen, and how to support the nonprofit sector. And then I think finally, we continue to believe that the nonprofit sector itself has to be resilient. And so we have essentially, for several of our programs, if a nonprofit had been funded for the last 3 or 5 years, we didn't require another application. We didn't require anything like that. We said, look, here's a grant you're going to get. Go out and survive and do the things you need to do to support the community on programs. So our point is to try to get the resources where it's needed, alleviate some of the stress and anxiety for those who are on the front lines, and then make sure that from a development and fundraising standpoint for the foundation, that we are in fact in position to provide resources this fall and into the winter when there's an expected second wave or second surge.
Great, thank you so much. Dallas, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, two things. One, just so that the audience is aware, we're not ignoring your questions per se, but we're, given the time restraints, we're very structured, so we can't actually address them. So I just wanted to acknowledge that people are sending in questions, but that we unfortunately can't address them online. The other thing is for my fellow panelists. It seems to me that nationally there's been a significant shift away from sort of a very structured, time-specific grant making to shifting to a much more nimble, quick model, being able to be much more responsive. And I'm just curious for myself and for the audience, if you're seeing that as well, that's a sort of a general trend, is that movement toward less rigid structure and hierarchy. Not that it's doing away with the safeguards that are always being put in place with grantees, but more so that it's just a much more nimble process than we would have seen a year, especially 5 years ago.
Dallas, that's a great point. And we actually have a funder collaborative here in the Low Country. So there are 5 foundations and three United Ways that have come together to create this fund. And I was meeting with the leaders from those groups a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that was pointed out by our colleague Carrie Forrest was that what this has taught us is that we can go fast and still do the diligence that we need to do and get the resources out. And so my challenge to me and my team is, let's not go back to those practices where it makes sense. Let's continue to be responsive. Let's continue to be flexible whenever we get beyond this pandemic. So I think it's disruptive, but frankly has been disruptive in a very good way for us as a community foundation in respect to that, to our grant making practice.
Yeah, I would agree. I'll be really quick. I would agree completely with that. I think it has really forced us to try to do grant making in a really different way, and it's for the best. We really are thinking about, wow, this works great. How do we simplify? How do we, expedite everything? Still doing the due diligence, but we can do this in a way that's not so burdensome to the grant applicants. I also wanted to say, I forgot to mention this earlier, that in terms of COVID, we're looking at it in sort of 3 stages. We've kind of through that emergent stage, but we're also looking at it in terms of recovery and resilience. That's sort of our general framework for moving forward. And I did also, Darren, you said something that made me think of this, that our donor advised fund holders have been amazing. They have just stepped up and I think that they have given more at this point in the year than we've had than normally would do in the end of a full year. So it's been really impressive how community DAF holders are just really committed and trying to do their part to have an impact on this issue.
That's great. Thank you so much. I want to sort of take that, what you guys just answered, and translate that into the on the ground for the grant applicants, and what does that look like and mean for them? So there were a couple of questions. One of them was related to how are you looking at how, I know as an individual who's developed many proposals for submission, there's a whole planning process. It usually takes 4 to 6 months to do it, and the way that I would approach it seems like it's changing now. So I'm curious, when you're looking at grant proposals, or when, Darren, you mentioned this a little bit, when you're working with individuals that are applying to grants right now, how are you working? Are you working with them any differently? How has that changed for those individuals that are applying to for grants right now, if anywhere?
Yeah, Angela, thank you for that. One of the things that we pride ourselves on is being accessible. A part of our equity platform is that we want to be accessible to the nonprofit sector. And so I think we've just sort of heightened this awareness for nonprofits in our region. And that is, pick up the telephone. If you look at our website, the program officer that's responsible for that program is there. And they are literally wanting you to call and to answer questions, to provide advice and guidance, because we think that's a much more responsive way for us to understand what's going on in the communities, for you to sort of wade through even the more simplified application process that we have, so that you're on target with what you're asking for, that we can guide you maybe to the right program. So that's a part of the relationship building that we're doing with our grantees, and frankly with our communities. One of the things I'll add is what COVID-19 also helped us to appreciate is that there are certain rural communities that don't have the nonprofit assets that are required, and so we've had to work differently through churches and civic organizations, and really have made a concerted effort to communicate differently to communities about the opportunity to partner with us and for us to partner with them. And that's been essential for us to deploy the resources, but also to get the feedback about where the gaps are and what's missing. And so that's been an invaluable piece of work for us.
Great, thank you. Any other additions?
I'd echo what Darren has said, that it's similar to our approach right now. I spend most of my time right now. We have a grant deadline coming up, so doing phone calls with potential applicants. And one thing that it's just my philosophy in general, but more so now, is to be very transparent. This is how much money we have to give. Here's the grant range. Here's the percentage of likelihood of being funded. Because a lot of folks have just been candid with me, like, if it's not worth it, I'm not going to apply. And so I try to give them as much information as possible. And we are focusing within education on a couple of key areas that'll be elevated above the other areas. And I've also tried to be really transparent about that, because it's been in response to what I'm hearing in the community about what people are most concerned about. For example, one of those things is the social and emotional health of students. That they're very traumatized by what's happening, and and teachers are concerned, parents are concerned about their emotional health. So telling people right up front, we're going to emphasize that this cycle. So the transparency and giving people the option to say, it's not worth it. I'm going to focus my attention elsewhere.
Yeah. And Oh, sorry,
No,
sorry,
please go
Dallas.
ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one thing is the referrals. Because we are working as funders in collaboration with each other, if we can't do it in a program, we definitely refer to the United Way or to another foundation. We do internal referrals to our DAF holders who might be interested in a particular area. So that, again, it's really sort of disrupted the normal way we would have done this process maybe a year ago to make us more flexible and communicating more internally on these opportunities to support our community.
Yeah, and I would just add onto what Julie was saying, that the transparency needs to run in both directions. And when grant applicants, grant seekers are approaching us, it's helpful for us if you're as transparent as possible, and because we're only going to have the information that's widely publicly available as well. And so if you're seeing something when you're doing your own ground truthing and recognizing there's a hole in the service net in your community, and you've suddenly shift from making widgets to making whatsits because the whatsit is what's needed right now, let us know that. Be really clear on why, so that we don't look at it and say, well, is there a mission drift here? Or whatever the process is that's causing us to wonder if something has shifted for you. Just let us know what it is, and be really transparent with us on all levels as well. Yeah, it's all about the relationships.
Yeah, accessibility and transparency on both sides, and I love that. So then I want to transition a little bit so we've been talking about COVID-related things and being responsive to the moment, but I also think there's a number of questions that came in from newer organizations or individuals who are kind of new to submitting proposals, and they wanted to know in your opinion, what makes a great grant proposal stand out in this sea of applications, kind of in general? What do you notice? You all review a number of them. So what are some things that you could share with the audience that you think are compelling and strong and you take note of?
I'll start. When I first read this question, my curt answer was just answer the questions that are on the application. But I think what makes the applications and proposals stand out more for me and for our organizations are the stats and the stories. And we use language around here from my old United Way days called simplify and amplify. If you can tell the stories, you can back it up with the data, you have a compelling argument to make for a grants committee. And that's what people want to know, especially in these days and times. They want to know who you're serving, how you're serving them, and what that impact has been or you anticipate will be. So simplify and amplify, stats and stories.
And I just want to amplify and answer the questions. We share that in our trainings all the time, where I always tell this story where I'm with Grant, I oftentimes facilitate these panels, and every single time without fail, there's always that response of something very simple like, well, if you could just answer the questions, that would be amazing. So I think that's just funny that you said that. So thank you for also sharing that. Go ahead, Dallas.
I would add in that also some of us don't have questions specifically for you to answer. The way that we're structured, which is not the typical foundation mode of operation, and I recognize that, is we work straight from a proposal, and it's a free-form proposal process. So for us, it's tell the most compelling story that you can. What sets you apart? Be as concise as possible, and let us know if there are specific challenges. So if I'm receiving a proposal from an organization that's been around for 40 years, and I know they have a large staff, my expectation of that proposal is going to be quite different than an organization that's been around for 6 months, hasn't had the opportunity professionalize the staff in the same way. Things in the proposal sort of stand out in a not so positive light. I can factor the questions A or B that I would typically expect to have answered aren't here because they don't necessarily know it needs to be there. So letting us know where you're at in your process as well helps us to read the proposal and give it a really fair shake, I guess is what I'm looking for.
That's great. Thanks, Dallas.
I think what I would add is that I guess first that I read for multiple funding areas, and I actually also still do consulting work on the side for the Colorado Health Foundation. So I literally am reading up to maybe 500 proposals a year. And so what makes that really important is that the clearer, I think this has already been said, but being clear, concise, it makes all the difference in the world. I recently was reading an application and the person hadn't done any spell check or probably hadn't had someone help edit. And I literally didn't understand what they were trying to say. And so we only have so much time. So you have to be able to get your message clearly and concisely. And also remember that as a reviewer, I am one person in a sort of a series of checks and balances and approval process. So help me make the case for you. And remembering that. So the combination of facts and stories, and I think every reviewer is different. I prefer facts. If everybody just submitted bullet points and said, we do this, this, and this is why we do it, this is the impact, I'd be like, great. So just remember that too. It's hard to accommodate every reader, but the clear, concise, and answer the questions. That is funny that other folks say that, and it is very true.
Great, thank you so much. Another question that came in, and so you kind of alluded to it, Dallas, in your remarks, is about newer organizations. We'll say those that have been around, there's two parts to this question. Those that have been around for 3 years or less, and any thoughts that you have about them submitting proposals to your foundations. And I also think that can be, another part of that question could be organizations that are submitting for general operating. What could make a compelling argument for general operating where you're not actually asking for a specific thing? So it's kind of two parts. If you don't take, you can take either part of that question. But those are two questions that people have about new organizations and around general ops.
I'll go ahead and jump in since I'm not muted. I think the first thing I would ask is that the organization asks itself honestly, is this a potential fit? The impulse with newer, younger organizations is to go out and touch base with as many foundations and funders as possible. And I don't really think that's a very effective approach. Get to know who you're approaching, learn as much about the organization, the funder, and their processes as possible, and just make sure that you are a good fit. In terms of programmatic versus general operating support, we're equally happy to do both, because my feeling is if we're interested in supporting part of an organization, why wouldn't we be interested in supporting the whole organization? And so we tend to skew more toward general operating, and happy to see that across the boards, that seems to be a general trend, is a much greater openness to general operating and recognizing the lights have to stay on or they can't run the program that we're interested in seeing them do. So.
Wonderful, thank you. Darren or Julie, anything to share there?
I think there was something that Dallas said that and it also goes to some of the questions I'm seeing in the chat. You don't try to fit a square into a round hole, right? So foundations, even the big foundations, they still have a limited amount of money. We have a budget. And so we try to target what we're funding in the way that have the greatest impact. And so if the work you're proposing doesn't fit within those priorities, yeah, don't waste your time. And I think that's probably the greatest reason that you know, for declines is it just doesn't fit with what we're trying to accomplish. And then I think, yeah, there was something else, but now I don't remember. But that's probably the biggest thing. And then I guess in terms of general operating a program, I think if your whole entire organization, for example, doesn't address education, which is the area I'm in, then it has to be a program within what you do. So I think that's where the biggest difference I see with general operating is if everything that you do fits within an objective area or whatever foundation calls it, then yeah, general operating makes sense.
Yeah. I would just add on to what Julie just said to just remind our listeners that we understand that you're very, very passionate about the programs and projects that you're working with, and a decline from a funder doesn't mean that we don't think it's a worthwhile project. I frequently decline projects that I think are amazing and so very, very worthy, but they're just not a fit for us. And so I would encourage folks to remember that. I often use this scenario, a dating scenario. Sometimes you go on a first date, meet somebody, and things are great, and it's a really good match. And sometimes it just doesn't work out at all. It's not a good fit. Doesn't mean you're not both amazing people who deserve to have great partners in your life. It's just not a fit. And so for me, that always helps when I'm having conversations with folks about that grantee grantor match.
Funny enough, the dating scenario, that's not the first time I've heard that. It's kind of funny that that's another metaphor that's used in this. Darren, did you have anything that you wanted to add on that part?
No, just if you're in the coast of South Carolina and you've done business with us over the last few years, you know that our bent is toward general operating support. As a matter of fact, we're trying to move more resources in that area and in that way. We do programmatic support. Some of the programs we run are limited to that. But to the second part of the question about new organizations, a few years ago, we created what we called our civic engagement agenda that identified gaps in certain communities that we serve. And then we did an internal audit of who we were funding, Black-led organizations, people of color-led organizations, and realized that where the needs were and what we were saying about our equity position weren't congruent with the reality in terms of how we were funding. And so we've really revised our grant making program in the Southern Low Country, which is the Beaufort area for us, Hilton Head, if you know South Carolina, and those rural communities around it, to really focus in on getting first-time grantees, smaller, not as resourced nonprofits, you might call them sort of grassroots, if you will, by providing both general operating support, capacity building grant alongside of that provides some coaching on everything from development to board governance, because we realize that certain communities really need those nonprofits to not only be there, but thrive and be successful. And so that's been a part of pre-COVID, the work that we've been doing to really champion equity in our grant making program.
Great. That's a perfect segue to the next question that I wanted to get to for the afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are, which is how, in your opinion, can organizations intentionally contribute to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in their work? And what questions, if any, are your foundations will you be asking of organizations and their leadership?
Well, I'll start in this response. And one of the things that, again, we turn the mirror internally first before we started looking outside. That's where we did the audit of our grant making programs and who we were funding. And what I would say to a nonprofit, if you are serving a constituent group of people, place or program programmatically understand who you are serving, what that impact is, and then for us, be able to report out on that particular demographic. I always say, don't be afraid to pick a major and then go excel in that major. So tell people what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then show the outcomes. That's another metaphor for you, Angela, the pick the major metaphor. But to go do that, and because there are enough things and issues in our communities to go around that we need people to be really focused on that. And then to Dallas's point earlier about transparency, is to just be transparent. If it's outside of the scope of the work that you do, then that's okay. But just understand that there's probably organizations upstream from you and downstream from you that we would like you to connect with, so that people have a front door to go into. So referrals are absolutely important for us. I'll stop with this. We use a measurement, we call it results-based accountability light. And so we're doing a lot of training with our nonprofits, regardless of the size of the nonprofit organization. It's not required for all of our programs, but we're quickly getting people to adopt it. It asks 3 questions. How much are you doing? How well are you doing it? Is anyone better off? And embedded in that is a quality improvement measure, a outcomes specific set of thinking in terms of theory of change. And it does frankly help us to be able to isolate and focus in on where people are maybe missing the mark in terms of equity based on what the community needs are. And then we publish, frankly, the civic engagement agenda and all of the data that's around that. So it's an open book test. Again, sorry for all the metaphors, but we want.
I love the metaphors. I'm writing down all the metaphors.
You know, I would add for us, one of the, I don't really like the word metrics, but I'll use it anyway. One of the metrics that I use is, I like to look at an organization and see programmatically, is it structured vertically or horizontally? And the more horizontal it is, the more I find that the staff are engaging directly with the community. The community is represented on the advisory councils, the boards, within the staff, that it's not the sort of old school, very vertical model of, we know what needs to be done and we're going to come in and do it. For me, that's usually a big red flag when I look at a program and see that, because it usually also follows that it's not very representative of the community that they're working within. So I'm a big fan of ground truthing. One of the things for me that is a little bit of a litmus test with my colleagues, other grant makers, is if we're talking about issues of homelessness, don't tell me that you've been to Skid Row in downtown LA on a bus tour to see what's going on. I want to hear that you got out of the bus, walked around, talked to people, had meaningful conversations, and let that conversation inform what you then go back and do. And I want the same thing from the organizations that we're supporting, that they're on the ground having conversations with the populations that they're working with, and that the programs really are what the community wants and needs.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so the demonstration has 4 questions that everyone has to answer. And that's how we sort of get at what is it that an organization is doing. And it's, what are you doing around racial equity? What are the challenges? How are you incorporating community engagement? And again, what are the challenges? And what we look at is that an organization is somewhere on the continuum of that work, because it really is endless work. So, and then also we look year after year, is someone at the same place year after year, answering the question in the same way year after year. So, and we look at it in terms of like I said earlier, what is the internal work you're doing in terms of things like who you invite on the board, who are you networking with, who are you advertising to for positions, to the external work. you know, we talk about community engagement. It's, you know, it's not just even talking to people that are homeless. It's like, are you able to engage them in a way that informs your work, whether it's a sort of like an advisory panel. So I'm not sure if that helps. We are looking for folks, and there are folks that have hired consultants for years, and they're going from the board all the way down to the staff. We also look at that they're analyzing everything that they do from a racial equity lens, and really deepening their understanding and then making changes. So that's sort of like I guess, the gold standard of really, you know, turning your organizations out inside and out to really understand what does it mean, and how do we start changing what we do and how we do it.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you all. This is I feel like we could go on for like another 45 minutes and just be sort of scratching the surface. We're coming up near at the top of the hour, but I wanted to, before we wrap up for the day, number one, I have to acknowledge that there are so many great questions that are coming in through the chat that we might have to figure out a way, you know, in the future ones to incorporate those. And I want to thank everyone. There's about 42 different things that came in that I didn't have a chance to read, but I just want to thank you for putting them in. And so I wanted to give an opportunity for each one of you to go around and give some closing remarks. And in those closing remarks, just kind of thinking about any advice that you have, encouragement or supportive words that you have for those nonprofit leaders that are the 664 individuals that are on right now, that are working out in the communities all over our country in this time, that, you know, as Julie says, like, we just don't know, and are trying to do their best. And so I want to just wrap up our time by having each of you just give some closing remarks and words of support from your perspective.
I would encourage folks to lead from your passion, because your passion is often what inspires us as grant makers. You know, be true to what your purpose is. Don't chase the money. The grant makers are out there who align with what you're doing. It's just an issue of finding them. And I know that can be challenging, but don't get discouraged, because they are definitely out there. And as long as you continue to stay true to your mission, and have honest, open relationships with funders, I think ultimately you will meet with success. And, you know, don't take declines personally. It's probably the biggest piece of information. It's not about you. It's not about your organization. It really is just about, is it the right fit? And if not, then hopefully, as we've said earlier, we can give recommendations on who might be a better fit. You might not want to go on a date with me, but you might want to go on a date with my friend, because I think you'd be a great pair. So I'll leave it with that. And thank you all for letting me be part of this morning.
Thank you, Dallas.
Yeah, I'll go next and just say to everyone on the call, if you're a nonprofit executive director, development officer, or anyone doing programmatic work, you are doing the hard work. You are, for our sector, the first responders, and I appreciate you and wish you well, both in the work that you do, but then in your own self-care. So you have to take care of yourself as well, and so I would encourage you to do that. The parting thought I would have, and it's something we do and that I preach here at the foundation, and that's to over-communicate. Just when you think we know what's on your mind, because we can read headlines and see applications, that's when you make the cardinal mistake or sin of assuming that we know, because we don't. So over-communicate with us. Let us know what's going on. Our program officers love to get your newsletters and to find out what's going on, to hear about a report from a grant that you received. Your donors like to hear as well. So ongoing stewardship of your donor base. We initiated something called care and wellness calls We didn't ask them for money. We just said to them, we care about you. We want to make sure you're safe and you're okay. And ultimately, in the course of that 15-minute call, inevitably they ask, well, what can I do to help you do what you're doing? And that's just again, not to ask for money, but to show your concern, to Dallas's point, building the relationship. And do the same thing with your boards and your clients, but tell your story, over communicate, and then fundamentally take care of yourself. We've got a lot of work to do ahead of us, and I think we can get through this. We have to stay strong and safe. So God bless you.
Thank you, Darren.
So I think the two things I would add, I also work a private owner, and we brought all her grantees together once, and she said, without you, I'm meaningless. Like, philanthropy is dependent on nonprofits. It is not necessarily the other way around. We have no reason to exist without you. And so I just don't ever forget that is, you were doing the work. And the only other thing I thought of is I know that I feel often overwhelmed with the need right now. And we recently had to do a grant review process where I said to my colleague afterwards, like, I feel like one of those psychological experiments we just had to do where there's a flood happening, we have a boat with 10 seats, but there's 30 people on the island. And I might make decisions about who's gonna live. And it really did mean some people lost their jobs as the decisions we made. And it was really painful. So I think you were also probably going through the same kind of stress, like we can't possibly meet all of the need. And you don't have to. I think really focusing on what is where you can have the greatest impact. What is your special sauce? What is the thing that you're best at? And try not to feel like you have to meet all of the needs, just meet the need that you are going to be best at meeting. So I think that would be the only other advice I would give.
Incredible advice. I just want to thank all of you so very much for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening. One of the things that I am always so moved by whenever we do panels like this at the center is just how much those of you that work at foundations and are grant makers care about the communities. It is the mission of the Grantsmanship Center to help nonprofits, create effective change in their communities. And really, you all are partners in that change. That we all, it's a symbiotic relationship. And I think as a nonprofit professional, I know a younger nonprofit professional, I used to think, oh, they're over there and it's sort of they're unapproachable, and I don't know how to talk to them or how to make myself sound good. But these panels just make the work that you do so visible and make your cares about what's happening in your community so transparent. And I just think that it improves the field as a whole when we realize your perspective along with our perspective of grants professionals. So I just want to thank you for your generosity of your sharing and transparency about what's going on with your foundations and your encouragement and support of the field. So thank you for being here this afternoon, for all of the work that you all are doing, for making it easier for those of us that write grant proposals to do it during this really stressful time for all of us. And I do think we have a lot of work ahead of us, and we will get through it together. And I'm really encouraged by that. And then for those participants that are out there, just in closing, I just want to thank you all for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, and for your questions. I want to thank our sponsors, Grant Station, of course, the Grantsmanship Center, and Foundant for making this possible for us to come together during this really important time. You will be receiving a follow-up email with some information about each of the sponsors and ways that you can keep informed and join us in trainings or some of the services that are being offered by our sponsors. As well, we have another one of these panels coming up on October 14th. So save the date. If you signed up for this particular one, you will get an email about when it's time to register. So I just want to again say thank you to our panels, thank you to our sponsors, and most importantly, thank you to all the nonprofit leaders that are out there that are doing the heavy lifting of making change in our communities. Have a great rest of the day, and I wish each of you well.